Some of you might have arrived here today with a heavy and troubled heart. There are certainly good reasons to be troubled in today's world. We face wars and rumors of wars. The economic situation has caused many of us to question our financial security. We hear on the news of shootings, terrorist attacks, riots, and many other violent and frightening events. We do indeed live in troubling times. So, speaking for myself, I know that I come here with a troubled heart. I am in need of a word of hope, a word of good news that will buoy my spirit. Is there any good news for me, for all of us, in this place today? In this morning's gospel text, we encounter two powerful stories from the life of Jesus. We actually encounter John's version of two well-known stories. The first is a reference to the feeding of the 5,000. The people were hungry, and Jesus took 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed them all. Now, how that happened, I don't really want to get into. If you read the commentators, there's lots of different explanations. Did Jesus actually create more bread and fish? I don't know. Did one little boy being willing to sacrifice his lunch shame everyone and cause them to bring out the food they'd hidden and share it with their neighbors? I don't know. All we know is something amazing happened and everyone ate. Now, something we miss in this story, if we don't really pay attention, is the conversation between Jesus and the disciples is much more clear. It's clearer in Luke. John kind of refers to it. Jesus goes to the disciples and said, "How are you going to feed all these people?" And Luke is a lot clearer when the disciples come to Jesus and say, "Send the people away because we can't feed them all and it's dinner time." Jesus turned to them and said, "You feed them." In Luke's version of the story, when informed the people are hungry, Jesus tells them to give the people something to eat. And so what do? The disciples go out and they do what they can do. They look around for food and they find 1 lunch, 5 loaves and 2 fish. And they present that 1 lunch to Jesus and then trust him to do the rest. And he does. Everyone is satisfied. A miracle occurs. We do what we can do, and then we trust God to do the rest. Is that how we function as a church? There's a story about a man who went to a town where he wasn't from for the weekend. And this visitor decided that he would go to the local church on Sunday morning. Not knowing when services began, he arrived quite early, so he had to sit on the front steps until someone came to open up the church. After a little while, he saw an elderly man walking down the sidewalk with a really severe limp. The elderly man approached the church, unlocked the door, turned on the lights, got the furnace going. Since they had some time before the service, the visitor talked with the old man, found out his name was Joe, and found out that the limp was caused because he really had a bad knee that was giving him a hard time, especially that morning because he had to walk about a mile to get to the church. He'd been opening up this church, unlocking the door and turning on the lights for about 25 years. It was part of his service to the congregation. People started to arrive. They had a lovely service. Afterwards, Joe lingered behind. The elderly man lingered behind because, of course, he had to lock up the church and turn off the lights. As people walked by Joe, a number of them stopped and said, "Joe, I know that your knee is giving you a tough time today. You're in my prayers. I'll be praying for you." The visitor stayed behind so he could talk to old Joe before he left. And after everyone had left, he went up to Joe and said, "You know, you must feel really good. All these people are praying for you. Isn't that a wonderful thing?" And Joe said, "Yes, prayer is a wonderful thing. But you know, this morning I really could have used a ride home." We do what we can do, and then we trust God to do the rest. In the gospel story, the people were hungry. Jesus told the disciples to feed them. So they did what they could do, gathering 5 loaves and 2 fish, and then trusted Jesus to do the rest. The first part, doing what we can do, sometimes gets left out, doesn't it? We are called to claim the rights we have as the adopted sons and daughters of God, to reach out to those in need, to those who are hurting in our midst. We are called to do everything we can do first, and then trust God to do the rest. In these troubling times, it is even more important that we remember to care for one another. That reminder that we are not powerless, that we can be part of the marvelous acts of God in the world today, that is indeed good news. The second story is of the disciples in a boat on a troubled sea. They fear the wind and the waves. In the midst of that deep fear, Jesus comes to them walking on the water. The text doesn't tell us that Jesus was wearing Ray-Ban sunglasses and could see the stepping stones, but we'll leave that part out. He comes walking to them on the water and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Do not be afraid. Sometimes that's easier said than done. Fear can grip us so deeply that we become paralyzed. Last night at the 5 o'clock Garden Eucharist, we do reflection questions at that liturgy. And one of the reflection questions last night was, what do you fear? What do you fear? And it was interesting that a few people mentioned the unknown as the thing they fear the most, the fear of the unknown. I think that's pretty honest. I think that's something that we all fear. There were some other insightful comments made too. A few of us talked about how we didn't really fear that much until we started having children. And suddenly we were afraid of a lot of things. When there'd be a noise outside when my children were young, before I had kids, I didn't care if the neighbors made a lot of noise, let them make noise. But once I had children, it was my job to protect them, so I was the one who had to get the flashlight and go out and find out what that noise was all about. Protecting the children. And then, of course, when they become teenagers and they're not home on time, you can't go to sleep. You sit there and are afraid until they finally get home safe and sound, as you imagine all these terrible things happening to them. Fear. Fear can blind us to a lot of things. When I would go out with a flashlight to find out what was making the noise in the middle of the night, rarely did I notice the amazing stars in the sky. I was distracted by my fear. Fear can blind us to the beauty of the sun coming up over the ocean. Fear can make us deaf to the joy of a child's gleeful laughter. While I was on vacation, I did get to meet my grandson out in California. And yes, he likes to laugh. So I heard lots of gleeful laughter. Fear can rob us of the comfort that comes from the gentle touch of a loved one. Fear can cause us to be so distracted by the waves of trouble we face that we miss the good news that our Lord and Savior is in our midst. Now, we can overcome this paralyzing fear. We can overcome this fear by placing our trust in something greater than ourselves. We can overcome this fear by trusting the one who declared, "Behold, I have overcome the world." In these times of trouble, may we draw good news from the message that we are called to be active participants in God's redemptive love. May we remember to first do everything we can do and then trust God for the rest. And when we place that trust in God, let us also remember to let go of those fears that blind us to the miracles happening all around us. When buffeted by the winds of fear, let us remember the words of Jesus. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid.